Hey, I'm Morgan, and this is the PS We Expire podcast.
Religion has a PR problem, I always say. Like, I'm a religion professor, I get it. I know why people have religious trauma. And even if you don't have religious trauma, like, religion gets associated with a lot of bad stuff, right? Abuse, dogma, power, politics. But I think it's really interesting to me or surprising to me how many people are willing to, like, listen to the idea that, like, oh, okay, but, like, just bear with me for a little bit and let's think about religious diversity, religious pluralism. Even if I'm not trying to convert you, I'm not religious myself. But what if we try to think about those as conversation partners as we're trying to figure out like how to understand what the heck is going on right now, which is very confusing, how to like picture a way forward, how to be a good human, what we think a real human life is about. Like, so if wellness is down here as too low of a bar, real well-being, like what if religion could be a conversation partner? And I think I'm surprised and excited by how people are like, all right, I don't like religion, but I'm willing to talk. I'm willing to listen a little bit. Like, all right, what do you got for me? I get that maybe my spirituality was a little bit thin. So what could you give me? This use this R word a little bit. Let's see what you got. And I think I'm that's really fun for me. Partly as a religion teacher probably, but I think it's because it's so surprising. I didn't know I was going to find that.
I I want to start with a question that
Yeah.
maybe sounds simplistic, but I think will set the tone for the rest of the conversation. How
Yeah.
would you define religion?
Yeah. I mean,
I'll start with an
so
easy one.
my entire discipline is a fight about this, right? And it's interesting. A lot of times in my Substack, I particularly get men in there being like, "Well, what exactly would be your, book textbook definition of religion?" I don't really have much at stake in that, like fighting about people like what counts as religion and what doesn't. For me, I have a really big container of what I count under religion. So I'm not just counting like the big five world religions. I'm counting a whole bunch of stuff that people would call spiritual, a whole bunch of stuff people would call metaphysical. For me, and also I define religion. This is a little bit of cop out, but it's true. As a scholar, I define it given what project I'm working on, that the questions I'm looking at might define a little differently, right? So like my last book, which is about religious appropriation and like cultural appropriation in like these religious spaces. And so I had to think about like, all right, what's the difference between religious appropriation and cultural appropriation? What's the religious part of it? So I had to think about how I was going to define it in that context. In this context, like in the Beyond Wellness book, I'm really just thinking about these super popular wellness practices that I'm sold all the time have religious histories, baggage, erasures, things that were taken out of them. And by that I mean like religious communities of practice that the religious communities that use this practice as a central ritual, for example, or religious thought traditions that thought that this practice would change you in certain ways, religious metaphysics. So a lot of it, some of it is like I think in each chapter, I almost am defining it a little differently. So, like the chapter on mindfulness, we're thinking about religious worldviews. So, what does it mean to have a religious worldview, which is the way you interpret what's happening in the world, but also how to respond to it? That's one way of defining religion. Like, if religions create a worldview that you sit within. Secularism is a worldview also. And so, do those things clash? If you're doing a practice that comes up out of a religious worldview and you are really against that religious worldview, could you end up feeling a little schizophrenic? In the chapter on movement, I'm really thinking about religion and how it creates communal collective sort of efforts and communities. So I'm using Durkheim there and thinking about collective effervescence, like when we show up together and we say liturgy together, or we sing hymns, or physically gather once a week. How does that create a sense of belonging and create shared values and sort of like make us want to gather again? So, I mean, this is a little bit of a cop out, right? But like, I think religion for me, it's a really big box. It's not what religion to my like secular friends means, which is like people who are religiously affiliated. Right now, they're thinking mostly Christian nationalism because that's like what's being really loud. To me, I'm thinking about it really like I don't want to police the borders. I want to expand them, I think. Which is not a very like satisfying answer. Definitely the dudes, the bros, they're always bros. My Substack don't like it when I won't like give them A one sentence definition. I mean, I think if I like sort of pushed, what do I think is different about religion than say like philosophy, right? So one thing I love about religion, I think it decenters the human experience, right? There's always, if it's not God, it's, if it's an indigenous understanding, it's like, nature and the sacred in a different way. So what does it mean to like, I think I talk about in the book is like lowering our main character energy a little bit, right? Like not just mine, but like just humans. So I think we tend to be very individualistic, like, and that's why I'm thinking about wellness. Like I can be well if I just do all the things, like take the supplements. I guess I'm supposed to take peptides now. That's what Instagram tells me now I need. This morning I was Googling, what the fuck is a peptide? I don't even know what a peptide is, right? Like if I do all the things, I will have a well life, or maybe I expand it to my nuclear family versus thinking about it collectively and communally, which I think religions always push us to do, or outside of like this timeline, right? So like whatever that means, if it means a higher power, if it means gods are gods, or if it just means a bigger understanding of like metaphysics or cosmology or nature and what we owe to nature and our place in nature or our ancestors. For me, like religion adds those dimensions to the conversation and kind of always forces us to like think about them or encourages us to think about them. And then there's so many different religious traditions and then pick a tradition, there's so much diversity within it. So the conversations you have can be so rich, right? So I mean, if you've been following me a lot on like social media, you see I'm doing a lot of stuff with conversation with like sort of Buddhism maybe or indigenous traditions, given what political things are popping up for me and where I'm finding great conversation partners, right? People to invite to I've been talking about it as like a dinner party, people to invite to the table to like learn from. But I think that decentering of like us and the human experience is sort of key to it.
How do we think then about religious traditions that actually do center humans or man as like the pinnacle of God's creation? So
Yeah.
a couple nights ago, I went and watched a lecture from Robin Wall Kimmerer, which was absolutely delightful. It was so
Yeah.
wonderful. And
Yeah.
she was explaining the difference between some of the indigenous ways of thinking about how humanity and nature are not separate but interconnected,
Yeah.
and the difference within the pyramid of religion that places man at the top versus man as part of the whole. So
Yeah.
that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, if I'm thinking about religion in terms of if there's some connection perhaps to the divine, to a sacred text, to rituals and practices that have persisted over time and that are used for personal and community connection, growth, and shared collective responsibility.
Yeah.
How do we think about religion in terms of something that where the hierarchy is essential to
Yeah.
the dogma or the theology even?
Yeah, I like my shorthand for thinking about that indigenous worldview that I love that I have from my friend Natalie Avalos, who I've been writing about a lot, is the idea of kin, right? Kin, like kingship, right? Like we are kin to plants and mountains. Like we are. It's not like we're not stewards, we're not in charge, we're not. But like there are relatives in that way. That's a super different worldview than what I grew up in, right? But it's very helpful for me for retooling myself. I think that like partly when you said man, I sort of thought like literally man if male. So like there's theology. If we stay with like Abrahamic religions, or if we just stay with Christianity, for example, there's Christian theology, and then there's kind of like there's bad Christian theology too, right? Like there's certainly resources in Christianity and tracks and veins to think about stewardship and nature and humility and things like that. It's what I find interesting is like I think we often think the loudest voices are the most correct. And I love to listen at the margins. I think super interesting stuff happens there too. So if I think about my chapter about food and detox diets, I go in pretty hard against forms of Protestant theology that got kind of naturalized, and like they're just in our DNA now. Like, oh, there's bad foods and good foods. Like that's like where did that come from, right? So tracing that back to these forms of problematic Protestant theology. But there's resources in Protestant theology that we can use for thinking about food differently and thinking about, again, stewardship and what we owe to like the land and what we owe, like, and our relationship to the land and how that's important to our own sort of, again, flourishing. So I think that there are resources that maybe are a little bit more, maybe they're not as like loud, or not, maybe they're not as well known, or maybe they're not as quote unquote mainstream. But often I find that there are those tracks almost in every tradition, or in some community affiliated with it, because I think that is centering. Like if you think about the male female, like there's patriarchy doesn't come from religion, but religious communities exist within patriarchal societies, right, and cultures. And so like the religious studies answer to that is like, yeah, of course there was sexism there because this was a community that lived in a sexist like culture with all kinds of gender norms. And so like maybe some of the egalitarian parts didn't get lifted up. So I often don't blame that stuff on the religion itself. But I do think that, again, that decentering, I feel like at its core, and I should say I'm not super neutral about religions either. If you read my stuff and you read me, I'm trying to create space for everybody who doesn't agree with me in lots of different values and lots of different sort of political affiliations. But I myself am personally interested in a form of religion that's engaged and pretty progressive. And, that comes through, right? So I'm not really interested in like highlighting parts of religion that I think feel misogynistic, right? Or feel super hierarchical. I'm interested in highlighting the things that I like, wow, we don't know how to think about imagination and hope, or we don't know how to think about death and dying, or sickness or vulnerability. Like we're really bad at that stuff. We're just trying to like live forever and be as happy, and like we're just trying to like even everything out, right? Versus I want to have those more hard, confused, discomfort, uncomfortable conversations, and so that's where I'm looking. But yeah, no, absolutely, it's totally right that there are strands. Wouldn't say an entire religion is patriarchal. I don't buy that argument. I think I can find egalitarian forms of everything, right? And I started my career in grad school studying Islam, and have learned tremendous amounts about gender from that tradition, despite, what you might think, oh, this is a tradition that like represses women, oh, the hijab, oh, that, but there's some really cool sexual ethics in there. They talk about female orgasm back in medieval, jurists were talking about bodily pleasure in a super interesting way really early on, a nice antidote to the way that lots of forms of Christian theology went in terms of devaluing the body. So that's sort of how I, maybe again unsatisfactorily, answer that question. But I like to lean in on the parts that maybe, well, personally, I like to take away the parts that line up my core values. That's what I'm going to looking for, conversations about that. And then I just try to offer to people, like, here's a full range of what's going on. Like, here's how, like if I teach, for example, I teach a class on sexual ethics, which is about Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And I tell them there's no hero in this class. There are going to be topics we talk about where you're like, oh my God, Islam's so much better on this. Other topics you're like, oh, Christianity, like there is no hero. And also I'm giving you'll find out that like if you want to talk about homosexuality and Christianity, I can give you a voice from every part of that spectrum from in that tradition that argues like any position you want, There's so much diversity within these traditions. And I just think we don't have a lot of religious literacy. We just kind of don't know it, right? It's weird. I feel like we all think we know what religion is in the US. Like, oh, I know religion when I see it kind of thing. I don't like it, or I like it, or it's my experience, or it's my religious trauma. But we actually really don't know a lot about religion outside of our own experiences because we're not taught it in school. We often don't interact a lot with people who are other religious communities. We don't, religion is not polite conversation to have, and I just think that's kind of a shame, I guess. And I think that there's some cool conversations to have there.
I think one of the things that surprised me the most about becoming an adult and getting outside of the bubble of the fundamentalism that I was raised in was understanding that even within, like you said, some of these Abrahamic religions, there's so much diversity. And that's not something that it really is explored or talked about within religious communities. And so not only are we religiously illiterate, but there's this like sense of danger or taboo or off limits. There's so much from my experience and from some of the other things that I've read from other people's experiences, there's so much protection within certain dogma that it doesn't really allow people to explore outside of that, because it does kind of poke at this part of ourself that's very tribal, very us versus them. We
Yeah.
have the thing that's right, and they have the thing that's wrong.
Every community thinks that they're right, right?
Yes.
And that's part of it. And it's important to police the borders. Like it's important to be like, we know, we're sure what we know is right because we're pretty sure what they know is wrong. It's a way to identify yourself. I think that's right. And I think that this, what I do, like kind of what I do, sometimes I say I'm writing for people who are non-religious affiliated, nuns, but I'm not, I'm finding that that's not who I'm really writing for, right? A lot of people who are deconstructing their religion are really interested in these conversations as well. But I do think that conversation can be harder for folks that come, who are in the process of deconstructing their religion, because their baggage is different, their associations with religion are different. Those categories, that rigidity, again, there are assumptions about this is what religion looks like. Like, so if I think about for example, I love talking about ethics and religion and norms and values. And that makes people pretty itchy who grew up in a religious community that had very conservative values, and they see that as very controlling, right? So it's easy for me to say, like, yeah, but look at this diversity in Christianity. And there's someone like a Margaret Farley, who is a Catholic social ethicist who had this very progressive understanding of sexual ethics, very different than like the last Pope, for example, right? Benedict. And like look at this, and if you're Catholic, you can choose to kind of go this way instead of that way. That feels different, or it lands differently on someone who's like, I was raised in this kind of Catholic church, and like this is the sexual ethics we were given. Oh, by the way, I was also abused by a clergy because I was an altar boy. It's totally different life experience. And so I think that what I'm finding is people are really interested in this conversation, but it's harder to like be generous, I think, with even just the concept of religion if you come from that kind of controlling background, and to imagine that there could be some version of thinking about religion that would help you figure out who, again, I'm not trying to convert anybody. So for me, it's just a little bit of a thought process, but how could you think about religion as a conversation partner in a way that works towards your goals of figuring out your purpose, your meaning, your set of core values, your politics, your vision of the future, what you think a good life looks like, what you think a good death looks like, all this stuff that I think is so important to having the most human life possible, which is going to become more and more important with AI. Frankly, I think we're going to become more interested in what makes us really human, as all the stuff that can get done by AI, gets taken from us.
Certainly.
So.
Yeah, that's an interesting question of what persists when many of the tasks that can be automated or done by AI are gone. And to me, the thing that continues to rise to the top, the cream that rises, is anything having to do with things that are in real life and things that help us explore these deeper parts of mystery and for humanity. How? What are some of your favorite stories from your book? Because I have a lot of notes of things that stuck out to me and places we could go, but I don't want to neglect the power of storytelling to explore some of these topics. So what would be, or even one that happened along the way that didn't make into the book that you're like, oh, if I had more word count available to me, I would have added this.
Yeah, I mean, there was quite a bit for the fitness chapter, which was like the most fun for me to research because I love doing that stuff physically. So there are a couple stories that didn't make it in, but mostly about like different sorts of modalities. I was like, oh gosh, this is like both very expensive and forms of religious appropriation and selling extreme thinness and I don't know, like all of it is like bad and toxic. So like some of the like stories from that fieldwork didn't make it in. I mean, I tried to include all my favorite stories, and for me, I mean, the whole book, hopefully, you have just finished it. I'm trying to really have it lead with stories. I'm really trying to have you come along with me and show you rather than tell you. Like, this is not like a book of like, here's what you do if you want to do yoga right, I mean, Lilias Folan, we can talk about because she just, because I've just been thinking about her in the yoga chapter. There's lots of stories often told about yoga and the invention of yoga and modern yoga, and I wanted to tell stories a little differently about that. And so I focused both on like a really high profile legal case, which is really interesting, but also two white women that helped yoga go mainstream that I think a lot of people don't know about, who are like doing yoga. And Lilias Folan, who just passed away this month, was one of them, who was called the First Lady of Yoga, who taught yoga on PBS. She taught yoga to my mom. My mom gets a lot of stories in this book. She's very patient being a pedagogical character in my writing. You know, my mom was a trailing corporate spouse and learned yoga from Lilias Folan on PBS in the 70s. And she looked a lot like Lilias Folan, who was this, attractive New England housewife with a long, beautiful, dark brown braid and looked really good in her leotard with an Om symbol, and was trained in devotional yoga and taught wellness yoga for like longevity and de-stressing and mental health. She taught a very watered down version of it. And if you learn about her story and what she kind of went through and then what she taught and then how it landed in someone like my mom, who was like, this really works for me and I can still be a good Lutheran and do this stuff, and it's not it's not too countercultural. It's not like the yoga of the Hare Krishnas, which we're also doing yoga. This yoga is for me. It's, safe because I've taken the Eastern religion out of it. And you see that move, and then you see how it landed in my mom, and then how it like trickles down to me. It makes a lot more sense than me just telling you, here's how yoga became popular. So Lilias Folan's interest, I like her as a character and as a story. I mean, every chapter tries to have heroes and villains a little bit. I don't know, the stories in the mindfulness chapter that I love the most are the ones related to Bhante Ji, who's the abbot at the monastery that I spend a week at in silent meditation retreat, which I frankly hated. I don't mind the silent. I do not like sitting meditation. It's really hard for me. Physically really hard. I didn't enjoy it. That was like one of the pieces of research that I was like, oh, I'm just gonna make it through this week. And Bhante Ji is really interesting. He's the co-abbot of this monastery. He's 97 when I was there. Just kind of like comes out for meals and to do a Dharma talk every week. You can kind of barely hear him during the Dharma talk. But he sat down with me and I was like, I need stories. You're a good storyteller. I need stories for my students to help them understand what I want them to see, that like what they're trying to do, what they're chasing isn't going to work for them. They're chasing, Brian Johnson's sort of tech bro life hacks. Like if I just put the right things together, if I sage my dorm room, if I do enough mindfulness every night, maybe I should try yoga, like maybe whatever it is, they put the right combination together. They'll have hacked themselves into they want happiness, they want to be optimized, they want peak performance, all those things that, wellness told us that the wellness industry told us we should have. And then he told me a couple of really cute stories. I mean, my favorite one is the one about drilling wells, which he said, well, okay, here's one. It's the one he started with. He's like, all right, so if I tell you, the key to enlightenment, for example, is to drill 100 feet, like drill well. That's how you get to the water, 100 feet. You got to drill down. And then you go away and you drill 10-foot holes in different locations. You're never going to find the water. And he's like, and that's what your students are doing. You got to pick one spot and you got to drill. And, and that means a couple of things, right? It means sometimes you hit rock, and you got to be like, oh, I got to back it up. And like, or I got to learn something new to go an extra 10 feet. Or I got to, oh God, this is like, takes discipline. And like, he's like, they're trying too many things and they're not learning any one thing well. And so I think that the whole book is a little bit of invitation to do that. Like, here's a whole bunch of stuff that I did. Where could you pick a spot right now and drill? Like, and what would that, if it's a practice, if it's a tradition, if it's learning more about how to listen deeply, learning more how to about discern what's going on around you, thinking more about the concept of hope, thinking about food, how does physical movement fit in? How do you think about a good death as part of a good life? How do you think about ethics? How do you think about outside of yourself? Like, how do you think about the collective as adding to your well-being? What do you owe other people? Whatever the thing is, it's not one size fits all, but find your spot and stay there and drill for a while, right? And then, there's no fast track, there's no fast lane. So I love that story from Banti G. He's also like, when I put it in his own words, it's way cuter in the book because he was just a good storyteller. He has a turn of phrase. So
I love what the story that he was talking about when he was performing the ritual of Peta. Is that how you say that? Where he was doing the chanting nonstop for an entire week. And because I think I just read a book recently called The Transcendent Brain, where it's like really trying to understand like what's actually happening on a neurological level when someone experiences has a transcendent experience, or is tapping into what some of the promises that are contained within the wellness industry or religion. What is that actually doing? And I was thinking, man, that experience is like what happens to our brains with sleep deprivation, and so many of these practices,
terrifying. It's terrible.
So terrifying. And it's interesting to think about people who do like sleep research and will systematically see what happens to people with sleep deprivation. But that was one of the things I loved about this book, was like thinking about what's happening in our brains when we are connecting to something that is talked about in many different ways within religion. And I'm really curious about, if we're thinking of this metaphor of digging the 100-foot well and finding water at the bottom, that's kind of exactly what you're talking about with the students who are looking for the water at the bottom. But I
Might not be
know
water.
and I don't know that it's very clearly defined. If we're like, I just want to be happy, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Because I don't think that anybody really wants to only experience happiness forever. So what are we really looking for here?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh. So much that you just said. So the Bhante G, I'm going to come back to the emotions in a second, because I think the happiness is interesting. I think we've been sold this idea that happiness, like only good emotions, only the good vibes are the ones worthwhile having. And that's not how life works, first of all. So like, you're going to be disappointed if that's what you're trying to do, but also that's not a fully human life, right? Like we're now in that household right now. This week is like the final week of college decisions coming out. It's not good vibes, right? It is like super, super stressful. How do you handle that with grace and patience and a good attitude, and see many paths through, like manifest? And I don't mean this like manifest like a purse or a sports car. I mean like, how do you think about what all these options are in front of you, what you could have a good life no matter where you go to college, right? You do not need to get into your dream place. But and again, that is part of, and getting through this week is more important than getting through the week where she gets in the school that she wants to go to, right? This is the week where the rubber hits the road and shows you who you are, and lets you move forward and not have regrets, because that's what we're saying. But anyway, the emotions thing is a big part of it. The Bhante G, what you mentioned is the Bhante G, his origin story, which is also fascinating, because here's someone, Bhante G, for those who don't know him, is a monk who helped really mainstream mindfulness in the U.S. He's one of the people who came to the U.S. and wrote books and taught it, and really helped it go mainstream as a Buddhist monk. He himself, his sort of like, and it's based on Vipassana, sort of form of meditation, but his own introduction to meditation was totally by mistake. It's based on, like what you said, there was a ceremony, he's a new monk. There's a ceremony to get rid of evil spirits, which involves chanting. It's like 7 days. You're supposed to take like a shift. Instead, he's very ambitious. He wants to do all the chanting the whole 7 days. So he talks the older monks into giving him their shifts. So he's like chanting 7 days straight with like only breaks for water and food. And by the end of it, he says basically he had a psychotic break. He went totally crazy. Like he couldn't focus. He couldn't read. He couldn't sleep. He was like depressed. It was just like, he wasn't himself. He's like, I went from an A student to not be able to like read paper. And what he learned, so they tried to like solve it in many different ways. And what he decided to try, which was kind of like Hail Mary, sorry to mix my metaphors, but he was like, I gotta try something, was to meditate, which was completely crazy in his particular lineage, because the monks they all learned about meditation at this time, but it wasn't like a practice they did. I know we think about monks sitting around and meditating all the time, but they're like, we're like teaching the Dharma. Like we don't have to, no one's sitting around meditating. It wasn't seen as a way to like heal yourself. And he found that meditation was a way to heal himself. So his whole introduction to it was like, sort of counter his own lineage, and he brings it to that day. He would bring it through that door, and I don't know. That whole story is like fascinating, and it's his origin story, and he tells it in such an adorable way. But anyway, I think your thing about emotions is important, and I actually do think people do want us to have a happy life. I think that that's like very naive, but I think that's what people are seeking for. And I think sometimes you come from a place of privilege, you believe that that would be even possible if you someone who hasn't dealt with a lot of whatever, violence or sickness or, some sort of trauma in your childhood. You're just like, yeah, I'm just gonna go through life the way I want to, and be in control, right? That's another thing that religion takes out of the picture. Like, you're not in control. And I love that. I mean, I think the more we can put the community back in, the more we can take ourselves out as the controlling sort of factor. I think the more we can open ourselves up to being like, okay, I'm not in control. So what do I do when these different bumps come on the road? How do I think about them as, also part of my full life?
I do think that the moments that we meet that the lack of control actually tend to be some of the moments where such massive change and transformation happens. Yeah. I really liked when you were talking about AA and how AA was started, and your experience with your dad having a really difficult time glomming onto the part of AA that talks about a higher power. Yeah. And something that you said in your book that kind of stopped me in my tracks, and I can't stop thinking about it, is the confrontation with the not God. That was such a wonderful way to reframe so much of this for me, was that it isn't so much about believing in a higher power as much as it is an understanding that you're not it. Yeah. that the illusion that we have of control over our lives is broken when we bump up against rock bottom through addiction, through loss, through grief, through any of these number of things. And the confrontation with the not God, I think, is a really interesting way to think about this.
Yeah, that was so helpful for me, because I was really having trouble working through the AA material, because it was frustrating to me that my dad, who was an alcoholic, he tried to work the AA program, and he just couldn't get past all the God talk. He was not someone who considered himself religious, and for him it was really off-putting. And so when I started the research about AA, I kind of came at it a little bit as a skeptic, really negatively, like, why are we offering AA to everybody when, like, the God talk isn't going to work for people? And, like, I know people would say that AA is spiritual but not religious, but, like, it's really hard to sit in an AA meeting and be like, there's not religion here. Or it's really hard if you look at the history to really honestly say this did not come out of, Oxford group, out of a Protestant group. So I get why he was like, oh, I'm not religious. I can't work this because of the God. And that was frustrating to me, because that's what was handed to him. That's what we hand to people in the U.S. to deal with. It's not true everywhere, but that's what we hand to people to deal with addiction in the U.S. is basically a 12-step program based on AA. And so I really was like struggling to figure out I really do think that if I approach these things with the most generous hermeneutic possible, everything from AA to like the woohoo manifestation, if I really dig in, there is a portable insight there. There is like a kernel of something that I think I can learn from. And for me, it was thinking about, like you just said, thinking about the God talk of AA, which it's everywhere, is not, and the higher power talk is not so much about, me or my dad having to believe in God, in heaven, but, or any sort of higher power, but just to believe that we're not that. And that seems a much easier lift for people who are not religious affiliated, to be like, and that would have helped my dad so much, not to feel like he was in control. I think there's like this thing that happens for people who are raised more secular like me, is that we look down on people who have God, right? We look down on religious people.
The
We
opiate of
fear,
the masses. Yeah.
yeah, open, no, I don't know. Those people might need religion to get through addiction, but I don't need it. And I think that's a big problem.
Hmm.
And I think that attitude, I think I saw that a little bit with my dad, and I think it prevented him from working the program. He's like, these people might need the God, but I don't need God. I'm an engineer. I don't need God. But the idea that you're not God, you're not in control, again, you're not the main character, that seems to me a really general, big lesson that is probably true for almost every religious tradition that I study, and is very portable to people like me, and I can apply to my life. And it actually really helped me understand, like, so I myself I went into it being like, I'm not affected by addiction, I'm just going to study this through the lens of my dad. And then realizing that as part of a family that had addiction, some of my anxiety around things I'm not in control of, right? I was like, oh, that's me trying to be God, right? And that I find that was a super hard chapter for me to work my way through. But I actually find that was probably one of the the biggest, most general lesson that I took out of the book. Like, oh, that's a good religious insight. You're just not God. Like, you don't have to believe, like, we don't have to define what a higher power is. I think people think that religion means theism and God. It's not true for all religions, certainly. But what if it just meant you're not God? Like, you're not the tech bro who's going to live forever, which I think is such a problematic way of thinking about a human life. So yeah, I love that about that chapter, even though, like I said, that chapter was, writing that chapter, my father hadn't passed that much before that chapter was being written. And he wasn't really, another thing that's hard about that chapter is he wasn't really out as an alcoholic. We sort of didn't do an intervention until his 70s. I always said I don't drink because my dad drinks too much, but we never sort of named him as someone who was an alcoholic until much later in his life, and he wasn't very public about it. So having to work through it that way was hard too. But I think that that's a really helpful lesson, and a nice way to think about religion for people who aren't religious. Like, oh, maybe that's all religion is. And you ask me what religion is. In that chapter, all religion is saying that you're not God. That's the part of religion I want to lift up in that chapter. That's it. Not theism, meaning there is a God that you have to define and we have to understand. Because theologians have argued about this forever. Like, what are God's attributes? How do we know there's a God? How do you prove God? I don't care. Those to me don't seem as interesting as, like, what if we just accepted that we're not God? Whoa. That's a good starting point. And I don't know that a lot of us do that.
I suspect that many people come to alternate methods of transcendence or altered consciousness like psychedelics because they're looking for a way to bypass or, like, break down those walls of still hanging on to this shred of, like, I'm in control of my life, and these states or experiences that help us transcend or escape the bounds of that way of thinking. Do you want to talk a little bit about your ayahuasca experience?
Yeah. Let me talk about that. That's really, in some ways, that's the best story of the book, which is why it's at the end, and the hardest story. I want to preface by saying I think that some people do go to psychedelics for the reasons you said, but I think that there's also people who go because they think they're seeking an experience with whatever, the divine, cosmic consciousness. And so to me, that does feel a little bit sometimes like pursuing the, like, I am God, I am part of the divinity, in a way that I'm always, like, want to, like, question, like, what people are hoping they're going to get out of it. But my psychedelic chapter, so I had to have a chapter about psychedelics. It seems like if you're going to have a chapter about spiritual wellness practices, psychedelics has to go in there, right?
Yes. Yep.
Everyone's talking about it. It's going to be legalized by the time our kids, I know you have preteens, it's going to be legalized for them by the time they're adults. It's going to be much more mainstream than it is now. I feel like it's already very mainstream among my Gen Xers. And I think that since, at least the 50s, scientists have been trying to prove that it's the way to create a mystical religious experience. So I am should say I'm I'm a prude. I'm not like an early adopter of psychedelics. I never had done a psychedelic before. I had no interest in doing a psychedelic. And I'm a little nervous about them because I think that they're incredibly powerful, even for people, I know who are really into them. And I think another thing I've learned throughout this book is if stuff is powerful, then it can also comes with risk. And I'm a little bit concerned that with psychedelics, there's so much energy around them that we haven't thought through enough the risk part, right? So part of my interest in like the religious container and religious containers that do psychedelics ritually was how do they think about risk and how do they mediate risk? So that was one reason I was like, I gotta include it. It's really popular. Also gonna think about risk. And then I was like, I'm definitely not gonna take any though. I'm. I was so sure. I was like, yeah, yoga. Okay, I'll do the quiet sitting meditation retreat even. I'll do the like exercise stuff with the mantras. I'll do all the things, but not the psychedelics. Because I'll just interview people. I'll go like observe and take some notes about what's happening. And I got convinced by someone who's an alien expert in religion and psychedelics that I wasn't going to learn what I needed to learn that way. And I was like, okay. And then I got convinced by that same person. This is Don Lattin, who's written a great book called The Harvard Psychedelic Club, which is about the experiments and the sort of group in Harvard in the 50s and 60s around psychedelics, like the Timothy Leary people. And the famous like Good Friday experiment, which they took, which is such also a great story, right? Where they took half seminary students, a bunch of seminary students basically gave half of them I think mushrooms and the other half like nothing or like a tobacco, and they put them in the basement of a chapel.
Had it.
Yeah, and it was really obvious, really quick, and they piped down like this like Thurman's like sermon, which is like this amazing sermon, and like had hymns and stuff, and it was really clear right away like who was tripping and who wasn't, and like they're like and then they gave them had them fill out surveys afterwards about what kind of mystical experience they had. Like anyway, so it was even back then we were doing experiments like that. But so part of that chapter is like looking back about, look, psychedelics are not new. They've been used by religious communities for a really long time. Here are just sort of a sampling of the way they've been used. And then looking through the example, particularly of indigenous use, which is one thing that's legalized in the US. But, and I was interested in indigenous use of psychedelics, but for good reason. Often those communities don't want outsiders to be part of those rituals. Those rituals are really for the community, and I 100% respect that. I think that another part of this book is understanding that sometimes the thing is not for you. You learn the thing and you're like, it's not for me. Not everything is for me. And I don't think that I deserve access or I'm entitled to access to someone's peyote ceremony that they're doing. But so I was looking at what kind of ceremony I could go to or what could I participate in, what would be easy. And instead I did the thing that was the hardest. So ayahuasca is not usually recommended as a beginner psychedelic, right? Usually they say like take a little ecstasy on the couch of a therapist and but that wasn't going to give me what I wanted because I wanted something in a religious container. And ayahuasca is one of the psychedelics that's taken in a religious context. And the one I looked at was the Santo Daime community. So I went to a church in Oregon. And Santo Daime is super, for a religion nerd like me, it's like fascinating. I could do a whole book about this tradition. I was so like, what? This is so cool. Because it's like this mashup of like Catholicism and Afro-spiritualism. It rises and it comes out of Brazil. There's mediumship. There's like Portuguese hymns. There's all this thick liturgy. It's this cool synchronous religion, and ayahuasca is the sacrament. So, and that's really interesting too, right? So, I didn't want to take any psychedelic as a drug. I was like, that's not the point. I thought about taking it as medicine, right? Like in that sort of indigenous context. But in the Santo Daime community, ayahuasca, which is called daime, they call it the daime, is a sacrament. Just like, you have, a sacrament, say, in the Catholic Church, where the idea is it's the way that you take in the divine, literally, and you communicate with the divine. And I was like, well, that sounds exactly what I'm interested in, right? And they have a ceremony, a ritual, and they have a container for, like, guiding you through it and integrating afterwards. So in theory, it sounded great. I only agreed to do it because it all happened very fast. I mean, I tell the story in the book about talking to the leader of the community on a Zoom call like this. It was like an hour. And being on a plane 7 days later with a suitcase packed of white clothes, because you have to be in white outfits every day. And then sitting in a yurt for 3 days, not eating during the day, taking ayahuasca, being offered ayahuasca 3 times a day, taking it at least once, if not twice, with 40 people, many of whom were channeling spirits, which I was like, I mean, for me, there's the religion nerd scholar of me, and then there's like the person who's in the experience as like in the experience, right? And the religion nerd to me is like, I can't believe I get to watch like mediumship and people channeling spirits. Like, I love this. This is so cool. And then the person who's like on the ayahuasca is like, oh my God, she's like definitely channeling a spirit right now because you're so altered that like, you're like, yeah, I think you are moving the energy with your hands or whatever you're doing with that spirit, or you are channeling some Portuguese person who has passed away and like, giving us a new revelation. And there was an exorcism. I mean, it was just like everything. The tent was wild, right? There was like mediumship, exorcism, music, people are purging, you're throwing up because of the ayahuasca, all that happening. Fascinating for the religion nerd in me. And then there's like what happened to me personally that I wasn't expecting and that I wasn't trying to have happen. I was like, I'm just going here as a researcher. But in 3 days, I mean, I was totally dysregulated. Everything was broken down. I was like dizzy. I had vertigo. It was like so overwhelming to my central nervous system. I spent a lot of time those first couple days like emoting, like that's how my body deals with stress. I'm just like crying. I'm like, not sad. I'm just like weeping, like another box of tissues, please. And by the third day, I thought about what I didn't want to think about, which was about the night my dad passed. Not about his like sickness that I had come to kind of terms with. My dad had pancreatic cancer and was sick for a really long time. So in some ways we got to say goodbye. Like I got to like do my goodbye and have that time with him. But the night of his passing, I was there, and I was there with the hospice nurse, my stepmother, but I was giving the morphine, and so I was really with him when he passed, and it wasn't peaceful. Like, he was agitated. I think he was a little scared, and it was traumatic for me to witness that, and I hadn't thought about that really. And on the last day when I had to think about everything I didn't want to think about, that's what I thought about. And so it shifted some stuff for me in a really interesting way. And I've since done hospice volunteer training. I'm thinking about doing death doula training. I'm thinking about even hospital chaplaincy. Like for me, it really had me think about how we don't think about death enough and we don't think about dying well. Like we avoid it, right? And like, I just spent a lot of time thinking, well, what would a good death look like? And how would you prepare for it? And how would you be ready for it? And how could it be on your own terms, right? Like, how could it not be medicalized if you didn't want it medicalized? How could it be in a space that you wanted? How could you decide the timing of it? How could you not be afraid of it? How could it be seen as like, and again, I'm not someone who believes in an afterlife per se, but still, how could you still have it be your understanding of it be part of a good life? So that, I tell the story in 3 acts over the 3 days, and it's a wild ride I take you on because I went through a wild ride. But that's kind of where I landed with it, thinking about what I didn't expect to think about. In a book about wellness, ended up thinking about dying and death and how that was also a part of well-being and also part of human flourishing. And darn, I'm the age now. My partner and I joke that, so we're in our 50s. We joke that he should get a degree in physical therapy because we're at the physical therapist all the time. And I'll become a death doula and we'll have everything covered, right? Because we're just at that age now. We're like, we have parents who are older. We ourselves are deteriorating in ways. But I think there's something to that, right? Like understanding the breakdown of the body also, and the end of life and coming to terms with that as part of living that really fully human life. Because, computers live forever. I know Brian Johnson and the tech bros, some of them think they're going to live forever. They're not going to live forever, though. So understanding that and confronting that and accepting that and coming to terms with that and figuring out how that affects how you show up now in your life is, it's interesting. I mean, other things happened to me that I'm less comfortable with. Like I was like, basically was told like I had tendencies, and not that I had mediumship tendencies, but I was really reactive to other people's energy and emotions, and I still don't know how to do with that information, right? But I could take that information about thinking about death and dying away and sit with it, and it was. I don't know if I would call it a mystical experience, but it was really a learning experience for me. And I should back up and say the religious container allowed that.
Yeah.
So I do not think if I had gone to a retreat in Peru and done ayahuasca, which is where most people do ayahuasca, with some like pseudo shaman, I would never have felt comfortable enough to think about the stuff I mean, I really just wouldn't have felt comfortable. I just like know way too much about what happens sometimes in those ceremonies. That people are assaulted, people die. I don't know the shaman, I don't trust them, versus being a community that does this regularly, part of a tradition that's done it for 150 years. No one's trying to make a buck off of me. Someone's watching me to make sure if I leave the tent, they know where I'm going. Jonathan, who's leading the community, walked over to me numerous times, which I talk about in the chapter, being like, "This is what I see right now, Liz, for you." And I'm just like, with my Kleenex, my box of Kleenex, like this, like okay. And he's like, "This is what I see, and this is what I think you should do right now." Like really caring for people and trying to guide them through it, protecting the space, telling people if they're faking being mediums to cut it out. All kinds of stuff were happening that made me feel I'm really being seen and witnessed and cared for here, that I can relax enough to think, like, just start to think about this as like possibly a sacrament. Like I couldn't go all the way there yet, right? I'm not an initiate. I don't quite believe in Sante Daime yet. So I couldn't fully experience the sacramental part of it, but I could sort of start to touch on what would that look like. And that was a religious container for me. I really 100% believe that. I don't think I would have just sat like this the whole time and like, if I had been in Peru in a retreat and just been like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, like let me survive, let me survive, let me survive. Like it just would have been too much. I mean, I don't want to do it again, but and I'm glad I did it because I think people will enjoy that chapter and it'll be a good conversation, like for them to think through what they might be wanting from a psychedelic or how a religious container could add to it or not add to it. But I don't want to, it's not going to be part of my ritual, my monthly ritual, my yearly ritual. Too much for me.
Yeah, I like what you were saying about the confrontation with our own mortality is something that is often missing from these health and wellness spaces, because it is really about like, how do I keep this body and brain like ticking at the highest RPM that it possibly can. And that is one of the travesties, I think, of Western medicine, the way that we've been detached from our communities that have rituals around grief and loss and suffering and death, is that a face-to-face confrontation with our own mortality is one of the most transforming things that we can experience. And the quote from your book, if I could read it, that I thought was such a beautiful way to, well, because this podcast is called P.S. We Expire, because so much of what I enjoy talking about on here is what does it mean to have a life well lived?
Yeah.
And this quote from your book says, "The second thing I brought back into everyday life was a new interest in the purpose of dying and what a good death might look like. What would it mean to approach death with acceptance, openness, and courage? To see the process of death as a necessary part of life, not its enemy. To prepare with friends and family in ways that are comforting and affirming to them. It might have been a psychedelic that raised these questions, but religion is where I'm looking for possible answers."
Yeah.
It's really beautiful. And I'm really curious about the ways that, if we're talking about wellness like a salad bar and people are kind of just picking and choosing, I'm curious about this same idea of these either religious traditions or something like AA. How important is it to kind of be sold on all the things that come with it in order to experience the full enrichment through that tradition or religion?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting having you read that quote. Like that chapter for me is really emotional. It's a chapter when I did the audiobook, which I just finished. Like I like teared up at some point when I was talking about my dad, and we had to like stop for like, and I think you'll hear it on the audiobook. There's this part where I'm talking about my dad where I'm like, I like catch my breath and then they had to like basically stop for 15 minutes because that was like a really different way for me for thinking about death, and also acknowledging that religion was really going to play a part in my personal life in that way, not just intellectual, but like it was really going to maybe be part of my answers to some of these things. The question of like how much, you know, I'm still okay with the like picking and choosing and combining, quite frankly, partly because that's where we are. Like there's no going back. That's what American religion looks like today. And there's also there's not really boundaries on these religious traditions, right? They themselves are like interact and like, but I do want people, like if we're talking about the salad bar, I'm fine with people putting like everything they want to on their plate. Like I like some cottage cheese, some sunflower seeds, some sprouts, whatever. But I want them to know what they're putting on their plate. I want them to understand the ingredients better, right? I don't want them to just put cottage cheese on because someone told them have to eat cottage cheese. My local grocery store is always out of cottage cheese. Always.
It's the protein.
It's never before. Like I have a Wegmans near, like out of cottage cheese. Whole Foods out of cottage cheese. Trader Joe's, everyone's out of cottage cheese. As someone who like eats cottage cheese, I was like, okay, I guess I had to shift things. Anyway, so I don't want people just eating cottage cheese because everyone's like, that's the thing you have to eat. I want them to know, like, okay, why are we eating cottage cheese? How is cottage cheese supposed to remake us? Okay, cottage cheese, I can't go so far with this metaphor, right? But let's pick something else. Where like, if you're gonna take a practice, if you want to like, I just want you to like know more about it. If you're gonna actually take a technique, for a couple of reasons. One is, I think often. Well, I'm partly interested in religious literacy, so I don't like the posture like, oh, religion is for those people and I'm above it and I'm just going to do the practice in this better way, in this scientific, therapeutic way. Like, again, I don't like that sort of like self-righteousness. So I want people to like stop that and like learn a little bit about the religious context and religious history. But also, I think because the more you learn about something, the more you either lean in or you lean out. And that's like the not one size fits all, right? Like, so like I liked cottage cheese and now I know how good it is for my bones and I'm midlife and I have to eat more protein. I'm going to eat more cottage cheese, fine, or actually it makes my stomach sour or whatever it is. Like sometimes you learn something about a practice and the metaphysical framing it came from or some of the tradition. And then you were like, that doesn't like line up with like who I want to be, what I need, my core values. And I think better to know that now than to do this thing for many years and then be like, I feel confused now. I created a form of schizophrenia or I like feel like this injury now to myself. So I think partly it's just a question of like consent and knowing what you're getting into and knowing what you might want to lean into. Maybe you want to lean more into the religious tradition, like, and learn more about, it's interesting. Buddhism, I'm interested in engaged Buddhism, but some of the forms of Buddhism that I engaged with for the book, I'm like, that's like not for me. I like don't want that kind of enlightenment. That enlightenment is not what I'm searching for. It's too removed from the world, or it's just not gonna play with like my politics or my sort of like life circumstances. When sometimes I learn about a religious tradition, I'm like, I need to learn more about that. I'm like really interested in like this, if not mediumship, this understanding of like reacting to energy that like Santo Daime talks about and thinking about sacraments and like altered states as like ways to understand the divine. Like, oh, I don't know, I want to lean in more on that maybe. Like maybe I do want to do a book project about this community as a way to learn about it. So I think that the picking and choosing, the combining is not really the big problem. I mean, there are problems with that if you want to think about issues of privilege and entitlement and cultural appropriation that can cause harm and offense, but I'm not trying to eradicate that practice. I just want people to know a little bit more about what they're getting into. I mean, like a good example is the sound bath chapter, which for the sound bath chapter I did, my big research was the gong crawl, which I called it in New York City, where like 36 hours I did 6 sound baths, which I do not recommend doing that many. And was like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I don't know how to listen to this stuff. Everyone's like, this is the easiest form of meditation. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. And one lesson of that chapter is like, what does it mean to really be a deep listener? And what traditions have, which traditions and communities have ways to train you to be a good listener. So maybe it's that you want to learn more about the Sikh kirtan tradition that teaches you to listen in a certain way. because that listening will show up in other parts of your life too, make you more emotionally intelligent, make you better at moral discernment, make you more able to lean into a whole range of emotions, because they really think about listening as about having these different emotions come up. So, but I mean, again, it's like, it's choose your own adventure. I just want people, I just think there's a lot more there. I think we're just leaving too much on the table. And I think this stuff could all work. I think we're drawn to it for reasons. I think it is very powerful, some of these practices and beliefs. And a lot of us aren't willing to like go all in on a tradition, right? But I think we could make it all work better for us if we understood a little bit more.
I thought of this analogy of religion being like a card game. Like if someone was playing Uno and I just blasted in there and I was like, just tell me about the draw fours, and then I like bam 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 like hit the draw fours, and then I win the game and I feel awesome about it. And the people who have played it for a long time and know how to strategically use a skip or a draw two, or they know all the rules, and and what they know is the pain and pleasure of playing the game, and how playing the game connects us to the people that are in the community playing the game. And so I was thinking about religion in this way of, if we're only ever thinking about what can this practice or tradition give me, instead of thinking about what you talk about in the book of what do we actually owe each other in these communities, and how is this not just an experience but something that is transformative? How does this belief actually show up in my real life? And that's a question that I think that people who have either been harmed by religion or who are like poo-poo about religion don't understand the deeper richness there of, like asking these questions, what is religion good for? I've asked that a lot since leaving fundamentalism, and investigating through, a psychological or neuroscientific perspective is like, what are these religions and these rituals giving to us? Why has this persisted over time? How has this become part of our evolutionary story? And why is it persisting through time? And what things are we missing by not asking some of those questions that take us deeper in the well?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And I think you're right that there's what those two groups share, right? The people who are like self-righteously outside of religion, it's not for me, and people who are deconstructing religion or have sort of religious trauma they're dealing with, is that complete distrust that there's anything a benefit there. And I mean, what you say about community is one of the big lessons in every single chapter. It turns out when you inject back in the religion, partly what it does is it helps, it's an antidote for that individualism that you started the practice with, like, right? That suddenly there's a community that you need to train you to do the thing. There's a community that you need for the support. There's a community that it's not just about getting from the community, but then the community that demands something from you. Real community, you owe something to that community, right? It's not just about extraction. Real belonging, you show up for other people. That's what, real belonging feels like. So what is expected in return? Like, what is expected to others or to, again, depending on what sort of, maybe if we're thinking about indigenous worldview, what is expected not only to just other people, but other creatures or just the land, to mountains, whatever. And I think that is a big lesson. We don't think we like that. I think we're very like, free will, just trying to like do my own thing. But I think that like responsibility is how I think about it, or just, obligations, which are, not words we like very much, but I think that they're also a key to real flourishing and well-being. This is a collective pursuit, real well-being. It's not something you can do alone. I mean,
yes,
as anything can tell you what's going on in the world right now, like you cannot flourish when all this other stuff is happening. So yeah, I think that's a big lesson from every single chapter, every case study. It turns out that religion just added back in that some understanding, some dimension of community in the collective.
I think that's what a lot of people are looking for in the wellness space, to have it detached from dogma, or from any connection to the mystery of the divine.
Yeah.
And I wonder, it's very obvious to me and to many other people that people find those same types of things in like being a Swiftie, or, I was thinking like in 500 years or 1,000 years, what are people going to look back on and be like, oh, that was religious? Is it going to an NFL game? Is it like, what are these collective rituals that we do together that still have all of those same flavors, those same ingredients of religion,
Yeah.
but are not necessarily just focused on the theology of it all.
Yeah. Or are thinking about, I mean, I guess I'm interested in like how is that theology getting, well, reimagined, reworked in ways that are maybe not legible to the way it would have been. I mean, religion, I think people think of like religion as this like, or religions as these static things. They like exist and like we're trying to get back to what they are. We're trying to like keep them going. But I always think that religious studies scholars often think about religions as modalities of change. They're traditions of how to deal with change, help us like go through change. And so maybe that's like, but maybe right now we're in a period too where like just our understanding of religion itself is changing because again of all that, like you're saying, that sort of aversion to things like dogma and rules and associations with religion with negative, connotations to things that people have done. I mean, if you look at the comments on my Substack or my Instagram, I'm always getting something like, "Why are you talking about religion? Religion is done, blah 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 blah." And I was like, "People have done X, Y, Z. Let's not blame religion for it all." And I'm doing something. I have a particular project here, but it's not. Again, it's not for everyone. And I want to be respectful also for people who are really still deconstructing, and that this like I'm not ready for this for sure. But I still think I still think probably reading my journey through Beyond Wellness will still be like, oh, okay,
Yeah, definitely.
that's a little interesting. I mean, also because we're just interested in like, there's so many different religious traditions that I walk my way through, but also just like, oh, I didn't realize that detox dieting and cleanses came from that. I didn't realize that some of this stuff had these religious roots in problematic ways too, right? This isn't only a story of like, yay, religion is the hero. Sometimes religion is the thing that's hidden from us that's causing like, oh, I love this idea of detoxes or whatever. I'm like, do you know where that comes from? Like, are you sure you like that idea? Like, that might be aligned with a form of theology that you do not actually agree with. Yeah, anyway, so it's really fun stuff to think about and talk to people about because it's really central to what we're all, I think, grappling with right now.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to ask you about how you came to this work. So being raised in a household with a Lutheran, or I guess I shouldn't assume what your childhood was like because you talked about your dad and your stepmom, but having a mother who's Lutheran but practiced yoga from more like a wellness or secular perspective, and then having a father that was not religious and couldn't engage with AA because of that thing that was such a
Yeah.
barrier. And so I'm really curious how did you get here?
Yeah. So my personal story, maybe it's not that interesting. How I got here was by mistake, let's say that. So my mother was raised Lutheran, my dad was raised Catholic. So she converted to Catholic to marry my dad in the Catholic Church. So I'm baptized Catholic. But then I was raised in a Congregationalist church. And I say raised, like my dad would say the Congregationalist church in our town in New Hampshire, he just thought it was like a country club. He was like, oh my God, it's just basically the social club of Protestant churches. But like, it's true. We had a lot of our family and friends. I went to Sunday school through middle school. But then I was like, as soon as I got to the age where I was like, I can make a choice, I was like, this is like not for me. And so religion was not a big part of my identity as a teenager through college. After college, I ended up working on human rights, and then I ended up working at the intersection of religion and women's human rights. And I worked for a couple of different groups, but the group I worked for before graduate school was a group called Catholics for Choice. And I think that was a big turning point for me because I was working on reproductive health access in Latin America, for example. And like, you got to understand the Catholic Church. Like, they're a big player, right? And that organization sees Catholicism as a resource for arguing for these things. So like they pull up things like safe motherhood and bodily integrity. And suddenly I was like, oh, religion's not a problem to be solved. Religion is a resource that people are already using to fight for these social justice things that I care about. And that's what sent me to graduate school. And and then I think in graduate school, my challenge was, I'm Catholic, technically, right? But I don't want to be, and I'm interested in ethics, but I don't want to be a Catholic ethicist or what is called a Catholic moral theologian. I don't have that identity. I don't want to work in one tradition. I don't feel comfortable. That's not my calling, right? I don't want to work from within. And so I was a comparativist. So I worked on Islam and Christianity. And then I've sort of worked like as an anthropologist for most of my career until this last book. And this last book is really personal for me because it's a little bit of a coming out for me because I realized that studying comparative religion for my whole career, which has been, 20, 25 years, has changed how I think about human flourishing and real well-being in my own life, like almost by mistake. I didn't realize it. It was like affecting me as well. And so beyond wellness and my work that's coming from it, the work that I do on social media now, is me sort of leaning more into the role of thinking about not just religion sitting as like an anthropologist, like an outsider studying it because it's like interesting, because it is interesting and weird to me. I love the messiness and the weirdness of it. But like right now, I need some help. Like, how can religion help? How can it help me? How can it help others? How can I set a table for a conversation that I think a lot of people are hungry for? At least that's what I'm finding. How can I invite the right people there and try to just facilitate that conversation? So this is like a new role for me. I was just in the New York Times last week, and they asked me the reporter asked me, Lauren Jackson, who has a newsletter called Believing, asked me if I was a public theologian, which is nothing I would have ever, no way in a million years in grad school would I have touched that with a 10-foot pole. Because theologians were the people who worked in their traditions. Mm-hmm. They were confessional, and I'm not religious. How can you be a theologian if you're non-religious affiliated? But I actually think I'm becoming more and more comfortable. Maybe this is like midlife when you don't care about anything anymore. You don't worry about it. I'm like, yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm a public theologian without religious affiliation who works, pluralistically, who talks to nuns, but also talks to people who are in religious traditions, who's interested in religion in the public conversation. I'm not the way a public theologian usually functions, maybe. I don't do all of what, serious theologians do. But I'm trying to become more comfortable myself with the idea of religion, right? And spiritual people often put the term spirituality on me, which is also a term I don't love. I have any connotations that most people have about religion. I have religious studies scholars don't like the term spirituality because we think it's just a branding thing. Spirituality is what you call the part of religion that you like, or that's really, if I ask my students what spirituality is, they give me a list. I was like, that's all religion. And they give me a list of religion. Like, that's religion too. You're just giving negative and positive. Or I think of like new age spirituality. And then I have bad associations of again, that sort of narcissism, individualism. But I think we're in a moment now, and this is really honest. It's optimistic maybe, or hopeful too, but I think we're in a moment now when people are talking about spirituality, there's a real sincerity and urgency to that. Like, people are like, I need some stuff, and I really am seeking. And then I see within my students a real concern for not doing the things that New Age spirituality, 60s and 70s did. Like, they're worried about appropriation. They're worried about stealing. They're worried about stepping on the toes of indigenous or Asian religions. They're worried about entitlement and privilege and extraction. And so I just think we are at this really interesting moment where I feel comfortable in that conversation in a way I don't think I would have 10 years ago. At least I hope that's where we are.
What do you think is contributing to that sense of urgency? The two things that came to mind were AI, because it's forcing us to think about what does it mean to be human, and then climate change. Are there any other things that you're seeing?
I think we're in an enormous moment of transition on lots of levels. I think climate is one of them. I think institutions, failing institutions, whether those are political, people just don't trust institutions, full stop. Crisis of expertise, people don't trust. And I say that as someone who has a PhD. I'm like the classic expert, right? We don't trust experts anymore. So I think an AI, is part of it. I think we're in an existential crisis, a climate crisis, a political crisis. If I think about my students, if I think about my teenager, oh my God, what a time to have to be going off to college. And the hopeful part of me is things are breaking apart, but something new will come. So that's what I'm hoping. But I do feel like a lot of things are breaking down. And I think that people feel that I think that's a heaviness and emotional, war. I can't even watch. I can't even read the news. I have to I'm only allowed to look at the news a couple times a week now on my phone. I can't look at it every day. And that, for me, this all started during probably COVID, but I can say that as someone probably of a position of privilege where, someone else may have felt this creeping up a lot earlier. But I think that that's where people feel, and I think also that things like, we're in a crisis of loneliness and a lot of that is like part of the failure of what wellness culture promised us. Like we've all been pursuing these things and then, it didn't work out as the way we hoped. I think about my students and the job, the stress about the job market and the bad job prospects. And yeah, I think there's lots of reasons to be the urgency to people to feel urgency in different ways. And I do feel like an underlying like, whoa, transition might be a nice way of putting it, or things are broken, or things are breaking. A lot of things rapidly. And again, I try to have hope. So I try to think that could be a good thing, but it's really hard to live through right now. I think. If you're paying attention, not everyone, some people are more isolated from it, right? This is the bad side of being incredibly online, is that sometimes you hear and feel and see things more than your actual life means that you would normally. I was talking about what was happening in Minneapolis with friends who were like, yeah, that's really bad. And I was like, I'm online so much that like I saw the videos within 10 minutes of different things happening, right? I saw things right away from multiple angles. And that, I think that something about that proximity also makes it harder. Yeah, I think you can pick your poison in terms of what is creating the urgency. But those are the places I see it.
You already mentioned something about like limiting the amount of time that you spend paying attention to the news. What are some other, maybe some like really practical, pragmatic things that you're doing to address this in your own life?
So I always I tell people I tell like junior colleagues, like I am nobody's model of a good work-life balance. I work way too much. I work way too much. I like working, I like writing, so I work way too much. But I do things, like some things are non-negotiables. I do a yoga class with my teenage daughter every Sunday. That's like this mommy and daughter yoga class thing that we do, which is like a really fun ritual. And, and we do a lot of family walks. So both like my partner and the dog, he and I'll go for a walk, and my teenager and I, like walking is a lot of how we talk. And physically for myself, I'm someone who likes to I strength train. So like lifting heavy weights is like my therapy.
Oh yeah.
And I'm in a community, I'm at a gym. I'm at this amazing gym that's just like black owned, young gym. Like the ownership is young, black owned, Roxbury, which is, not really my neighborhood. Brookline, it's like a sort of different part of Boston I go to lift. Really great community that I feel, really supported by and love that. I just posted something last week about how if you have sisters, something about like therapy. Oh, so my sisters are my therapy. I'm really close with my sisters and things like that. So, and for me, a lot of the work that I'm doing, like the writing that I'm doing, I'm crazy right now. Like the book finished, I just kept writing. Right. So I'm like writing 2 Substack essays a week on top of my normal life and work, which is, again, no one recommends that. And I'm sure my subscribers are like, oh my God, another essay from Liz. Okay. But that is also part of the work I'm doing. This is actually what I worry about with AI and people no longer writing. I work through things. I figure out what I think. I figure out where I'm going by writing through stuff. So and the book is the same way, right? I'm really, I'm thankful that people will let me write. If there's a way I can write. Because that's how I'm figuring out my way through this stuff. And I think I mentioned thinking about, so my daughter's going off to college next year. And so I'm thinking about, this is a big transition for me, and trying not to fill it with work, which would be my normal inclination. And so that's why I started the hospice volunteer training and thinking about how do I want to fill that. I spent a lot of time thinking about my daughter, organizing her life, regulating her emotions, whatever it is. You're about to have teenagers, so you'll know all too well, depending on what kind of kids you have. How do I fill that space with service outside of And so that's one way I'm thinking about doing that. Again, it's like I feel like it's not really self-care, but I think it is sort of self-care. I think feeling that you are contributing to your community and that you have purpose and meaning outside of your work identity is important to me.
It's a funny question, like when people are gonna get their undies in a bunch about what's my purpose, but they're doing that sitting by themselves in a room, and instead of learning through service to others, learning through understanding, the ways that you need to grow often are not eliminated unless we're in relationship.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I that's really sound advice in that I hear movement, paying attention to what's happening in your real life right now,
Yeah.
tangibly, community work worth doing, and service to others.
Oh, good. That's much better than what I said. I'm going to write that down.
I mean, that's everything that you just said. I
Yeah.
was like, yes, blah, 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 like
Those are
hit
the
all of the things that.
And my dog, and my dog. I'm obsessed with
And
we have
your
a new puppy.
dog.
Yeah, so we love,
Yeah.
we love a family pet. Yeah.
I love that. Liz, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so excited for people to read this book. It really is, it's incredibly easy to read, and not because the subject matter is easy, but because you're a very good storyteller, and you make it really accessible for people to think about these things in a way that if it came from an academic or, like very terminology heavy way, it's,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been as accessible. So I appreciate the deep personal things that you share in this book, and I'm excited for people to get to read it pretty soon.
Oh, thanks. And thanks for the conversation. This was really fun. I knew it
Yeah, it
would.
was really lovely. Great. Any last words or final parting thoughts for listeners?
No, just that if they want to order it before the 28th, there's a pre-order bonus. They can get early access to a chapter and a workbook, and you can order on my website at lizbucar.com. And if you want to keep following the stuff I'm doing, I'm easy to find on Instagram. I post a lot on Instagram. So that's Liz Bucar also, just my name, Lizbucar. And my Substack is called Religion Reimagined. And I have very, very spicy comment sections on my posts. So it's not really about, I was talking to someone about how they're like, how did you get whatever 13,000 subscribers in like 6 months? And I'm like, it's not that I'm the best writer, it's that I'm like creating the space that people wanted to have. And so the comment section is often like the best part. So if you're someone who likes Substack, it's a really interesting conversation happening there too. So
Oh, wonderful.
and you can
Well,
subscribe to it. Yeah, so you don't have
yeah,
to.
links for everything will be in the episode notes. And for all of my listeners, before we go, P.S.